A fire crackled in the grand fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the walls lined with perfectly staged photos. Laughter, the kind that felt practiced and expensive, circled the mahogany dinner table like a garland on a too-perfect Christmas tree. The air smelled of pine, roasted turkey, and a subtle, expensive perfume I'd always associated with my stepmother, Susan. I was playing my part, nodding along to stories I wasn't in, smiling at jokes that landed like lead balloons in the pit of my stomach. I was a guest here, an invited one. That was the unspoken rule. My name is Dorian Marston. And this wasn't my home. My grandfather, Ernest, a man whose hands were still calloused from a lifetime of work, despite his wealth, raised his glass of bourbon. His eyes, usually clouded with a gentle nostalgia, were bright with pride. The conversation lulled. All eyes turned to him, the patriarch, the bankroller, the man who believed his legacy was secure. But his eyes didn't sweep the table. They landed on me. Only me. Dorian, he began, his voice a warm, gravelly sound that usually comforted me. Tonight, it felt like a trapdoor opening beneath my feet. Now that we're all here, in this beautiful place, tell me, do you like your new house? The silence that followed wasn't quiet. It was a vacuum, sucking all the oxygen, all the fake warmth out of the room. The clinking of cutlery stopped. I could feel 4 pairs of eyes drilling into me, but I couldn't look away from Grandpa's proud, expectant smile. I froze. My mind went blank, then raced. My new house? I glanced at my father, Gregory. He was suddenly fascinated by the pattern on his dinner napkin, meticulously smoothing a non-existent crease. I looked at Susan. She offered a thin, tight smile, her gaze dropping to her wine glass as if the Merlot held the answers. Ben, my half-brother, just kept chewing, his expression blank, unaffected. Of course, this never had anything to do with him. They had forgotten to tell him. In their carefully constructed narrative, they had forgotten to give Grandpa his lines. A cold calm washed over me. This was the moment. The crack in their perfect facade. It's a beautiful house, Grandpa, I said, my voice surprisingly even, a stark contrast to the tremor in my hands under the table. But it's not mine. The words hung in the air, tangible and heavy. You could have heard a pin drop on the plush Persian rug. Grandpa's smile didn't just fade. It collapsed. His gaze flickered between me and my father, waiting for a laugh, a correction, a something. None came. The warmth in the room didn't just dissipate. It was murdered. Gregory cleared his throat, a weak, pathetic sound. Susan's painted-on smile was gone, replaced by a pale, tight-lipped grimace. Grandpa slowly set his glass down. The sound of crystal on wood was like a gunshot. The tension in his shoulders was visible, a tide of anger and confusion rising in him. He turned to my father, and his voice lost all its warmth, replaced by a sharpness I hadn't heard in years. Gregory, I thought this house was for Dorian. Susan jumped in, her voice too high, too sweet, like spoiled honey. It is for the family, Ernest. It's our dream home, for all of us to share. I almost laughed. The audacity was breathtaking. I knew better. Laughing would only play into their hands. They were always ready to label me dramatic, ungrateful, the difficult one from my father's first, less convenient marriage. It's fine. Really, I said, reclaiming the narrative. My voice was still calm, controlled. The reasonable one in a room of lunatics. I was just invited for dinner. It's a lovely dinner. The silence that followed was loaded, a bullet chambered in the barrel of our family's lies. It begged for someone to pull the trigger. Grandpa's eyes, now stormy, locked on me again. Why don't we take a little walk, son? It wasn't a question. I nodded and stood. My chair scraped against the hardwood floor, a sound as harsh. And final as a verdict dot, as I followed him out of the dining room, I caught Ben's eye. For the first time that night, he looked up from his plate. And in his glance, I didn't see sympathy or confusion. I saw accusation. I had made a scene. I had ruined Christmas, but I hadn't. I'd simply told the truth. That was my first quiet act of rebellion. The front door closed behind us with a soft, definitive click. The cold winter air was a slap in the face, a welcome shock. Snow was falling in soft, lazy flakes, muffling the world and sharpening every memory. Grandpa didn't speak right away. We walked down the steps, past the 2 perfect wreaths Susan had chosen, and stopped near the curb. Under the glow of a street lamp dot, he turned to me, his face etched with decades of hard work and hard lessons. Tell me the truth, Dorian. No more family politics. Is this your house or not? I looked at him, at the man who had taught me to throw a spiral, to change a tire, to be a man of my word. The only one who ever called me son without it. Feeling like a negotiation. No, Grandpa, it's not. I don't live here. I wasn't told it was being bought. I wasn't asked for my opinion. I was invited for Christmas dinner after it was done. He stared at me, blinking slowly, processing. I could see the pieces crashing together in his mind. I wired money to your father, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Over $400,000. 2 years ago. For a down payment on a property. In your name, Dorian, your name. I know, I said, the cold from the snow seeping through my shoes. I found the email last week. His jaw tightened. And the deed? Belongs to him and Susan. Did you sign anything? Anything at all? No, nothing. I didn't even know this house existed until the Christmas card arrived. It called it our family's dream home. That's when I knew something was off. The wind picked up, whipping around us. I could feel the betrayal settling into his bones, the same cold, sick feeling that had been living in mine for weeks. But this was different. This was his trust that had been violated. He had believed he was building a foundation for me. They had used it as leverage to build a palace for themselves. I'll deal with this, he muttered, more to himself than to me. His eyes were fixed on the warm, glowing windows of the house. Gregory thinks he's clever. He thinks I'm an old man he can manage. He thinks you're disposable, I corrected quietly. Grandpa turned to me, and for the first time, he really looked at me, not as his grandson, but as an ally, a fellow victim of a carefully executed coup. You were never that. Your mother, God rest her soul, would have never let this happen. She made me promise. I know. We stood there in the cold, the night swallowing our breath. The warmth from the house, the sound of clinking glasses, and Susan's curated holiday playlist felt like it belonged to a different universe. A universe I had never been a part of. Come back to Chicago with me, Grandpa said, his voice leaving no room for argument. I hesitated, not because I didn't want to, but because the offer was so vast, so salvation-like, it felt unreal. I have a room. Hell, I have 5. One of them is yours. Always has been. I looked at him. He wasn't offering pity. He was offering solid ground. And after years of quicksand, I needed ground more than I needed air. I'll pack my things. He nodded once. Final. We didn't go back inside. We didn't owe them an explanation. We just got into his old, sturdy car and drove away from the beautiful lying house. As we turned the corner, I looked back one last time. It looked less like a dream home and more like a beautifully wrapped box with nothing inside the next morning. I left without fanfare. No goodbye from Susan. Gregory, I was told, was still in bed. Ben texted me later. You didn't have to make it weird, man. I didn't reply. The game had changed. Their rules didn't apply to me anymore. Chicago greeted me with a biting, honest chill that cleared my lungs of their perfumed lies. Grandpa's house was large, old, and solid. It smelled of old books, lemon polish, and fresh coffee, a scent of truth. He showed me to a room, but it wasn't a guest room. On the walls were photos of me, frames I didn't know existed. My high school newspaper column, the program from my debate state finals, even a faded, poorly drawn sketch I'd made when I was 10. He'd kept everything. "This is your home," he said, his voice rough with emotion. It always was. And for the first time in years, I believed someone. Later in his study, he handed me a document, his old will, the one that had never been filed. "Gregory's going to say it was a misunderstanding," I said, my fingers tracing the notary. "Seal. He'll twist it. Say you were grieving for Grandma, that you changed your mind." Grandpa nodded slowly, his eyes sharp. "That's why I asked my lawyer, Atwood, to dig, to see if Gregory ever filed a new version, an amendment. So far, nothing. No amended will, no new filing. He just let it sit and let me believe." He looked at me, and the weight of his years pressed through the quiet of the room. "I'm ashamed, Dorian. I handed him power I should have given you. I didn't speak. I couldn't, because a part of me, some bitter, broken part, had been waiting my whole life to hear someone in my family say those words. I failed you. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the library, surrounded by the evidence of a life my grandfather had cherished and my father had tried to erase. I pulled out my laptop. This wasn't about hurt feelings anymore. This was about evidence, property records, deed history, mortgage trails. The digital paper trail doesn't lie. It wasn't just the house Gregory had taken. It was the whole illusion. The down payment Grandpa wired had been funneled through a shell LLC registered under Susan's maiden name. The mortgage was refinanced 6 months later under Gregory's sole control. My name had never appeared. Not once. He'd planned it from the start. And the Christmas card, it wasn't just a card. It was a performative lie mailed to dozens of relatives. "Thanks to your generous legacy," it had said, "we built this future together." They had used my grandfather's good name, his love for me, as a marketing slogan for their own social climbing. And I was the afterthought, the ghost. The next morning, I printed everything. The will, the wire transfer records, the LLC filings. I slid it all into a crisp, clean folder. Grandpa watched me from across the breakfast table, his steely gaze over the rim of his coffee cup. "I want to do this right," I told him. He just nodded. "You always did." This was no longer a family dispute. It was an investigation. And I was just getting started. The quiet son was done being quiet. The erased era was about to rewrite the story. And the first chapter of my revenge had just begun. The silence in Grandpa's Chicago library was different from the one in that Christmas dining room. That silence had been heavy with lies. This one was charged with purpose. The scent of old books and brewing coffee was my new reality, a stark contrast to the staged cinnamon and pine of the house that was never mine. I sat at the large oak desk, my laptop glowing in the dim morning light. The folder of printed evidence, the will, the wire transfer, the LLC documents lay beside me like a loaded weapon. But a good soldier doesn't just know how to fire. He knows the exact architecture of the battlefield. He finds the weak points. My father, Gregory, thought he was smart. He thought covering his tracks meant deleting emails and using legal jargon. But he forgot the first rule of a digital world. Everything leaves a shadow. Grandpa had given me everything: access, trust, and the quiet, seething anger that comes from realizing you've been played for a fool by your own son. His financial advisor, Atwood, is at your disposal," he'd said, placing a business card on the desk. And so am I. My first call wasn't to a lawyer. Not yet. It was to an old college friend, Leo, who now worked in digital security. The kind of guy who could find a needle in a haystack made of other needles. "Leo," I said, my voice low despite the empty house. "I need a favor, a big one." "Dorian, man, it's been ages." "You sound intense. What's up?" "I need you to look into an email account for me. My grandfather's. I need to know if any filters were set up, if any emails were automatically forwarded or deleted from specific senders about 2 years ago." A whistle came through the phone. "That's specific. And messy? Family stuff?" "The messiest." He was quiet for a moment. "Send me the details. I'll see what I can dig up. No promises." Next, I called Mr. Atwood, Grandpa's lawyer. His voice was like gravel and expensive whiskey, calm and assured. "Dorian, Ernest told me you'd be calling. I've already started pulling the property records for the Christmas Creek house. The deed history is interesting." "Interesting how?" "A transfer of funds from your grandfather to the Marston family. Trust is clear, but the trust itself was only established a week before the wire was received. The trustees, Gregory and Susan Marston. It was never meant to be a family home. It was always their investment vehicle." My hand tightened around the phone. "And the will? The original one naming me?" "Never filed, as you know," Atwood said. "But its existence, combined with the financial trail, establishes a powerful donative intent. Your grandfather's intent is the key. We can argue Gregory held that money in a constructive trust for your benefit. He violated that trust. The terms were legal, but the meaning was beautifully simple. My father was a thief who used a lawyer's dictionary instead of a gun." Later that day, Leo called back. His voice was buzzing with the thrill of the hunt. "Dorian, you were right. Your grandfather's email? Someone set up a sophisticated filter. Any email from realtor domains, from banks, even from your grandfather's own lawyer, containing the words property, deed, title, or Dorian was automatically tagged and moved to a hidden archive folder, and they were all automatically forwarded to another address. I already knew the answer. "Which address?" Gregory.Marston@pmail.com.bo. He hadn't just hidden the truth from me. He'd hijacked my grandfather's communication to maintain his lie. He'd created a wall between me and my own future, brick by digital brick. "Can you prove it?" I asked, my heart pounding. "I just did. I've sent you a packet of screenshots and server logs. It's all there. Your old man is thorough." "He's a criminal," I corrected, my voice cold. "Yeah, that too." I printed Leo's findings. The packet was thick, filled with technical data that was utterly damning. I added it to the folder. My weapon was now heavier. The final piece came from an unexpected place: memory. I was boxing up some of my old things from Grandpa's attic, surrounded by the ghosts of a happier past when I found it. A leather-bound planner from 2 years ago. Grandpa was old school. He wrote everything. I flipped it open. And there it was, in his precise, looping handwriting. * July 15th. Meeting with Greg and Dorian property viewing on Christmas Creek. 3 p.m. * I wasn't there. I never got the invite. August 10th. Conference call with bank. Dorian's mortgage pre-approval. I was never on that call. * August 20th. Wire transfer to trust. $425,000 for Dorian's house. * The capitalization was his. He'd underlined it twice. He hadn't just emailed his intent. He'd documented it in ink. This was the sledgehammer that would shatter my father's defense of miscommunication and assumptions. I took the planner downstairs. Grandpa was reading in his armchair. I didn't say a word. I just placed it open on his lap, my finger pointing to the August 20th entry. He read it. His face, usually a mask of tough resilience, crumpled for a single heartbreaking second. Then it hardened into something else. Resolve. He looked up at me, his eyes glistening. He knew, Grandpa whispered. He sat across from me at this very desk and helped me write this. He knew. I know, I said softly. That night, I assembled the entire dossier. It was no longer a folder. It was a narrative. A story of theft, meticulously documented. The promise, the old will, and the handwritten planner. The theft, the wire transfer, and the trust documents. The cover-up. The email filters and server logs. The lie. The Christmas card and the staged family. Dinner. I held it in my hands. This was more than evidence. It was my voice, finally speaking in a language they couldn't ignore. The next morning, I called Mr. Atwood again. I'm ready, I said, but I don't want to just send a lawyer's letter. I want to do this in person. A formal deposition? It's early for that, Dorian. We usually start with no, not a deposition, a meeting. Neutral ground? A restaurant. I want to look him in the eye when he sees it. Atwood was silent for a beat. I could almost hear his professional admiration. That's unorthodox and risky. He'll be defensive. He'll have his lawyer. Let him, I said, the ghost of a smile on my lips. I have the truth. The meeting was set for a Tuesday afternoon at the Oak Room, a pretentious downtown steakhouse I knew my father loved. He'd feel powerful there, in control. Perfect. I arrived early. I wore a simple, dark suit. I didn't look like a victim. I looked like a professional. I ordered a sparkling water and waited. He walked in 10 minutes late, of course, making an entrance. He was wearing that smug, expensive overcoat he bought during a market peak, the one that screamed provider, not predator. His lawyer, a slick man named Nathan Vaughn, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, trailed behind him. Dorian, my father said, nodding as he sat down. No hug, no son, just my name, a move in a chess game he thought he was still winning. Gregory, I replied evenly. Not Dad, not anymore. I let him order his overpriced steak. I let him sip his rich, red wine. I let him feel the illusion of control. He made small talk about the market, about the weather. I nodded politely. The performance was almost impressive. When the waiter left, I placed the thick, crisp folder on the white tablecloth between us. He blinked at it, then offered a thin, condescending smile. What's this? A Christmas list? You know what it is, I said, my voice calm, flat. His smile tightened. He opened the folder, flipping past the first few pages, the will, the wire transfer. His smile vanished. He saw the email server, logs, the printouts of the hidden filters. His face paled. The recognition was instant, followed by something uglier, insult. How dare I uncover his secrets? He closed the folder and pushed it away slightly, folding his hands on the table. He looked at me not with guilt, but with annoyance, like a man looking at a leaky pipe that had finally burst. You dug up the old will, he said, his tone dismissive. It was premature. Your grandfather was grieving. He asked me to hold it. We talked later, and he agreed it made more sense to hold the property jointly. You talked, I said. I wasn't in the room. You weren't ready, he snapped, shrugging. Let's be honest, Dorian. You've never been great with responsibility. This would have been a burden. There it was, the core of his narrative. I wasn't wronged. I was incompetent. I was being protected from myself. I took a slow breath. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I let the silence hang in the air, magnifying the absurdity of his lie. I watched his confidence begin to flicker under the weight of my quiet. Then I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a near whisper that forced him to listen. Don't confuse quiet with weakness, Gregory. I wasn't supposed to be ready. I was supposed to be obedient, and now I'm neither. He said nothing. The air between us crackled. I don't want the house, I added, watching his eyebrows lift in surprise. Not anymore. It's tainted. I want the truth on record. I want Grandpa's name cleared. I want every single family member who got that Christmas card to get another one, with the real story inside. His lawyer, Vaughn, finally spoke. Now, Dorian, that's defamatory, and I cut him off, my eyes never leaving my father's. And if you say no, I said, a cold smile finally touching my lips, then you'll hear from Atwood and Sinclair. They're filing the original will with sworn testimony tomorrow. And if I have to take the stand and explain these server logs to a judge, I will, gladly. My father stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly. He snatched the folder off the table. He didn't say another word. He just turned and walked out, his lawyer scrambling to follow. I stayed seated. I finished my sparkling water. My hand was steady. I had fired the first shot. Not a loud, dramatic bang, but the quiet, precise click of a hammer being cocked. The war was on. And for the first time, I was the one controlling the narrative. The silence after my father stormed out of the oak room was more satisfying than any dessert on the menu. I sat there, finishing my water, the weight of the folder now gone from the table, but its contents permanently etched into the space between. U.S. I had thrown a stone into the still pond of his perfect life, and now I would wait for the ripples to become waves. Back at Grandpa's house, I found him in his study, polishing an old set of brass navigational instruments. He didn't look up. How did it go? He took the bait, I said, leaning against the doorframe. He was annoyed, not apologetic. Called me irresponsible. Then he ran. Grandpa gave a short, grim nod, buffing a sextant with a soft cloth. He never could face music. He didn't choose himself. He finally looked at me. He'll retaliate, not with honesty, with noise. He was right. The first ripple came not from my father, but from Susan. 2 days later, a long email landed in my inbox. The subject line was, "Family and Understanding." It was a masterpiece of manipulation. She didn't deny anything. Instead, she reframed it all as a tragic miscommunication, a perfect storm of good intentions. She wrote about how stressful it had been for them, making such a big decision, and how my distance and sensitivity had made it difficult to include me in the process. She painted herself as a peacemaker, worried about Grandpa's health, about the unnecessary stress I was causing him. It ended with a guilt-laced plea. We just want peace, Dorian, especially for Ben's sake. Ben, using him as a human shield. Classic. I didn't respond. Silence. I was learning was its own form of power. My lack of engagement denied her the drama she craved, the back and forth she could then use to paint me as the unstable one. I simply forwarded the email to Mr. Atwood with a single-line note for the file. Exhibit D, the performance, the next. Ripple was more direct. A formal letter from Nathan Vaughn, my father's lawyer, arrived at Mr. Atwood's office. It was a masterpiece of legal posturing, full of phrases like, without prejudice and without admitting liability. It was a settlement offer. The terms were telling. I would be added to the deed of the Christmas Creek house as a 1/3 owner alongside Gregory and Susan. They would offer a one-time goodwill financial gesture, a pathetically low sum, to help me find my footing. In return, I would sign a comprehensive non-disclosure and non-disparagement agreement. effectively buying my silence forever. They wanted to shut me up. They wanted to make me a minor shareholder in my own stolen future and pay me off with what amounted to pocket change. They wanted to sweep the entire ugly truth under a very expensive rug. Grandpa read the letter, his face a mask of contempt. "He thinks you can be priced," he muttered, tossing the paper onto his desk. "He measures everyone's integrity by his own. What do I do?" I asked, though I already knew the answer I wanted. "We do not negotiate with cowards." Grandpa said, his voice like iron. "We correct the record. Finish this." That was all the confirmation I needed. To Mr. Atwood, we sent back a one-sentence response. "The offer is rejected in its entirety." The rejection triggered the wave I knew was coming. Vaughn filed a motion in court. But it wasn't a denial. It was something far more insidious. The motion claimed that Grandpa, at the time of drafting the original will, was not of sound mind and memory, that he was vulnerable and deep in grief after Grandma's passing, and that Gregory had acted prudently by not filing a legally precarious document. He was going to call his own father senile to keep his house. When Mr. Atwood called to tell me, his tone was grave. "This is a common tactic, Dorian. It's ugly, but it can be effective. It forces us to prove capacity, which can be messy and invasive." I thanked him and hung up. I felt a cold fury settle in my bones. This was lower than I had ever imagined he could sink. I waited until that evening, when Grandpa and I were having dinner, and I slid the motion across the table to him. He put on his reading glasses, his hands steady. He read the entire document in silence. When he finished, he slowly took off his glasses and set them down. He didn't look angry. He looked profoundly tired. "He did that," he whispered, more to himself than to me. "He actually did that." Then he stood up, walked to his old roll-top desk, and unlocked a drawer. He pulled out a large, leather-bound planner, the one I'd found in the attic. He brought it back to the table and handed it to me. "This," he said, his voice regaining its strength, "is every appointment I had with the realtors, the bank, the inspector, the title company. Every phone call logged, every signature, every check I wrote, dated, initialed, all from that time." I opened the book. It was meticulous. Detailed notes on interest rates, property tax comparisons, structural reports on the Christmas Creek house. This wasn't the work of a man losing his faculties. This was the work of a sharp, methodical, and utterly committed businessman. He just handed us his weakness. I said, a plan forming in my mind. "What's that?" Grandpa asked, his lack of character. The following week, we held our strategy session with Mr. Atwood and a new addition, Ms. Moria Keller. Atwood had brought her in as litigation counsel. She was in her 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a handshake that could crack walnuts. She reviewed our entire dossier, her expression unreadable. When she finished, she looked up at me and Grandpa. "The motion on capacity is a gift," she said, her voice crisp and clear. "It allows us to put your father's character on trial, not just his actions. We can now introduce all of this," she said, tapping the planner, "to prove not only that Ernest was of sound mind, but that Gregory's claim is a deliberate, malicious lie." "What about the house?" I asked. She smiled, a thin, predatory thing. "The house is almost secondary now. This is about elder financial abuse, fraud, and perjury. This motion gives us the runway to go for everything. Under Miss Keller's direction, we began to build a fortress of fact. We got certified records from Grandpa's doctor stating he was, and always had been, mentally acute. We had the bank officer who handled the wire transfer provide a sworn affidavit that Grandpa was clear, direct, and specific about the purpose of the funds, and we had the planner, the undeniable ink-on-paper proof The date for the first hearing, a preliminary motion to dismiss Gregory's claim, was set. It wasn't the full trial, but it was the first battlefield. Miss Keller prepared me relentlessly. "He will try to get under your skin," she warned. "He'll use words like sensitive and dramatic. Your only job is to be a stone wall, facts, dates, documents, no emotion." The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I wandered down to the library. Grandpa was there, sitting in his armchair, staring into the cold fireplace. "Can't sleep either?" I asked. He shook his head, thinking about tomorrow, thinking about him as a boy. He always had to win, even at checkers. He'd flip the board if he was losing. He looked at me, his eyes sad. I should have seen it then. "It's not your fault," I said, meaning it. "It's not yours either," he replied. "Remember that tomorrow." The courthouse was smaller than I expected. Beige walls, fluorescent lights, scuffed linoleum floors. It felt less like a temple of justice and more like a DMV that settled blood feuds. My father was already there, flanked by Vaughn. He was wearing a new suit, too new, and his hair was dyed a jarring uniform black. He looked like a man trying very hard to look like he wasn't trying. He didn't look at me. We took our seats at the plaintiff's table. Miss Keller was a calm, immovable presence beside me. Grandpa sat directly behind us, a solid wall of silent support. The judge, a woman named Justice Ellen Monroe, with a no-nonsense face and a brisk demeanor, entered. The hearing began. Vaughn went first, oozing smarmy concern. He painted a picture of a confused old man, a grieving son trying to do what was best for the family, and a difficult, estranged grandson blowing everything out of proportion. Then it was Ms. Keller's turn. She stood, calm and poised. "Your Honor, this motion isn't just without merit. It's a deliberate attempt to defame a competent man, an obscure fraud. The evidence of Mr. Ernest Marston's sound mind is overwhelming and documented in real time." She began presenting our evidence, the doctor's letter, the bank affidavit, and finally, the planner. She passed it to the judge. "This, Your Honor, is Mr. Marston's personal journal from the period in question. It details, in his own hand, every step of this complex financial transaction. This is not the work of someone lacking capacity. This is the work of a meticulous, intentional individual." The judge slowly flipped through the pages, her expression unreadable. Vaughn objected. "Of course. This is a private diary, Your Honor. Its contents are irrelevant, and it's directly relevant to the defendant's motion," Miss Keller cut in smoothly, "which claims the testator lacked capacity. This proves he did not." The judge held up a hand, silencing Vaughn. She spent a long few minutes looking at the planner. Then she closed it and looked at my father's lawyer. "Mr. Vaughn," she said, her voice dry, "your motion hinges on the claim that Mr. Ernest Marston was not of sound mind. This document suggests he was arguably of sounder mind than I am on most days." Motion denied. Just like that. It was over in minutes. Vaughn looked stunned. My father's head snapped up, his face a mask of sheer, unvarnished shock. He had played his nastiest card, and the judge had torn it in half without a second thought. As we stood to leave, my father finally made eye contact with me. The look in his eyes wasn't anger or defeat. It was fear, pure, unadulterated fear. He realized his plays weren't working. He was no longer the puppet master. He was just a man in a bad suit, facing the consequences. Justice Monroe wasn't finished. She looked directly at my father. "Mr. Marston, based on the evidence presented here today, I am advising the court clerk to forward this file to the district attorney's office for a preliminary review of potential elder financial abuse. Have a good day." She left the bench. The room was silent. My father looked like he'd been physically struck. The game was no longer about a house. It was about a jail cell, that Mrs. Keller packed her briefcase without a word. Grandpa put a steadying hand on my shoulder. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clean. We walked out of the courtroom, leaving my father and his lawyer sitting there, surrounded by the crumbling ruins of their strategy. The first battle was won. The war was shifting. And for the first time, my father was truly deeply afraid. The victory in that beige courtroom was cold and quiet. There was no cheering, no dramatic music, just the soft click of Miss Keller's briefcase closing and the heavy weight of my father's terrified stare burning into my back as we walked out. Justice Monroe's recommendation to the DA's office had changed everything. This was no longer a civil matter. It was a potential crime. Back at Grandpa's house, the mood was somber, a shared understanding of the line we had just crossed. We had not just won emotion, we had unleashed the hounds. Grandpa poured 2 fingers of scotch, his hand remarkably steady. He brought that on himself, he said, not to me, but to the ghost of his son in the room. You don't call your own father a senile old man and expect to walk away clean. The following days were a tense calm. Mr. Atwood and Ms. Keller were in constant communication with the DA's office, providing the mountain of evidence we had built. The waiting was its own special kind of torture. Every phone call made my heart jump. It was during this quiet storm that a new ripple appeared, one I never saw coming. A voicemail, not from my father, not from his lawyer. From Susan. Her voice was strained, stripped of its usual performative sweetness. It was just tired. Dorian, it's Susan. I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, but I left something behind at the house. In the attic. It's in a blue tin marked Christmas lights. If you find it, just please don't throw it away before I come by. I'll only be 5 minutes. Click. No apology, no explanation. Just a desperate, strange request about a box of lights. In an attic I now owned, but had never fully explored, I played the message for Grandpa. He frowned, swirling the ice in his glass. A blue tin? Evelyn had a tin like that. For old photographs. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing. Don't go alone. I waited 2 days. Let her sweat. Let the silence from our end become its own unnerving force. Finally, I replied with a text. Tomorrow. Noon. Don't be late. She wasn't. She pulled up in her sleek silver SUV, but it seemed less shiny somehow. She looked smaller, diminished, the sharp edges of her designer clothes seeming to hang on her. The armor was cracking. I opened the front door, but didn't step aside, blocking the entrance. You said 5 minutes. She gave a tight, nervous nod, clutching her handbag. Yes, thank you. She walked in, her eyes darting around the empty, echoing space. The house felt different without their curated clutter. It felt honest, even in its emptiness. She stopped at the foot of the stairs, her hand brushing the banister as if for luck. I'll go straight up, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I'll come with you, I stated, my tone leaving no room for argument. This was my house. I would witness whatever this was. The attic door stuck, just as it always had. I yanked it open, the familiar smell of dust and forgotten things wafting down. Susan moved with a purpose that surprised me, heading straight to a far corner, past boxes of my old childhood things and some of my mother's holiday decorations. She didn't hesitate. She knew exactly where it was. She moved a stack of old blankets and pulled out a large, rectangular blue tin. The label, written in faded marker, indeed said Christmas lights. She held it with both hands, not opening it, just gripping it like a lifeline. Is that it? I asked, my voice echoing slightly in the cramped space. She nodded, but her lips were trembling. She looked suddenly frail, standing there in the dusty gloom. "Do you mind if I sit for a second?" she asked, her voice thin. I gestured to an old wooden stool. She sat down heavily, the tin resting on her knees. The performance was gone. This was something real, and it was terrifying her. "I suppose you want to know what's in here," she sighed, not looking at me. I said nothing. I just waited. I had learned the power of silence. She cracked under the pressure of it. Her shoulders slumped. With fumbling fingers, she pried the lid off the tin. There were no Christmas lights inside. It was filled with letters, stacks of them, bundled with rubber bands. The paper yellowed with age. She pulled one out and held it toward me. I didn't need to take it to recognize the looping, elegant handwriting. "My mother's," she wrote. "To me," Susan said, her voice barely a whisper. "A lot. When we were younger, but especially after you were born." She finally looked at me, and her eyes were shining with unshed tears. She kept everything, even the ones I never sent. Back, my throat tightened. I took the letter. The paper was fragile. "Dear Susan," it began. "I know we've never seen eye to eye, and maybe we never will, but Dorian is here now, and whatever you think of me, I hope one day you'll think of him differently. He didn't ask for this fractured family, but maybe he's what heals it. Maybe he's the one who sees past all the things we've both ruined." I couldn't breathe. I looked from the letter to Susan, who was now openly crying, silent tears tracking through her makeup. "She gave me this tin before she passed," Susan choked out. "Told me to give it to you when the time was right." The anger that rose in me was so hot and sudden it blinded me for a second. "Why didn't you?" My voice was low, dangerous. She flinched. "Because the time was never right. And then Gregory and I had plans. And you were always so distant." The old narrative, the excuse, surfaced for a last, dying gasp. I didn't let it stand. I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound in the dusty attic. "Distant? You built a house without me. You put my brother's name on the deed. You called it a family home and mailed out a lie to everyone we know. Don't call me distant. Call me erased." Her composure broke. "Because he made things easier," she burst out, her voice rising with a decade of pent-up frustration. "Ben didn't question. He didn't make us feel guilty. He just fit." There it was, the ugly, naked truth. It wasn't about my capability or my stability. It was about my inconvenience. I was a living reminder of a woman my father had failed, and a past Susan could never quite overwrite. Ben was a blank slate. I was a book already written, and they didn't like the story. "You didn't want a son," I said. The heat in my voice gone, replaced by a chilling certainty. "You wanted a silent partner in your fiction. And when I wouldn't play the part, you gave my role to someone else." Susan looked down at the tin in her lap, her shoulders shaking. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought if we just moved on, it would be better for everyone." "You didn't move on," I said, my voice flat. "You covered up. There's a difference." We sat in the dusty silence for a long moment, surrounded by the ghosts of Christmases past and the wreckage of a family present. She finally stood, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She looked old. "I'm sorry," she said. And the first time, it almost sounded real. It wasn't a performance for an audience. It was a confession in an empty attic. But forgiveness isn't a switch you flip. It's a debt that has to be paid, and her apology was a down payment on a mountain of betrayal. I stood, taking the tin from her. It was heavier than it looked. "You can take 5 of the letters," I said. "The ones you wrote to her. The rest stay here, with me." Her eyes widened in surprise, but she didn't argue. She just nodded, selecting a small bundle from the tin with trembling hands. She had been the keeper of my mother's words for too long. That duty was now mine. We walked back down in silence. At the front door, she turned, her vulnerability already being tucked away behind a mask of regained composure. Is there anything you need from me? I thought about it. I thought about the court case, about the DA, about leverage. But that wasn't what this was about anymore. No, I said. But if you ever speak to Ben again, tell him I don't hate him. He just made his choice. I met her eyes. And so did I. She nodded, a quick, jerky motion, then hurried to her car without looking back. Later that night, I sat at the kitchen table in Grandpa's house, the blue tin open before me. Letters were spread out like a map of a secret history. Some were angry, some were pleading, some were hopeful. My mother's soul, poured out in ink to a woman who would never understand her in her grief. Her fear, her fierce love for me, she had written herself raw. And Susan, flawed, fragile, and complicit, had been its terrified guardian. Grandpa came in and saw me sitting there amidst the papers. He didn't say a word. He just put a hand on my shoulder, squeezed once, and went to make a pot of coffee. I wasn't here to redeem Susan. Her guilt was her own to carry. I was here to reclaim my mother, to take back the narrative that silence had tried to bury. The attic was empty now, except for one box. It held the tin and all the letters. I'd placed a new label on it, written in black marker. Not lights. Still. Shines. The game had changed again. I was no longer just fighting for a house or a legacy. I was fighting for a mother's voice, and I had just been given all the ammunition I would ever need. The blue tin of letters sat on my desk in Grandpa's library, a silent, powerful monument to a truth that had almost been erased. Susan's visit had shifted something fundamental. This was no longer a battle between father and son. It was a reckoning for a stolen legacy, for a mother's silenced voice. The letters were my mother's testimony, and I intended to see it delivered. The call from the district attorney's office came on a Tuesday morning. They were formally opening an investigation into Gregory Marston for elder financial abuse, fraud, and perjury. Justice Monroe's recommendation had been the push they needed. Our mountain of evidence was the roadmap. Mrs. Keller was clinical, efficient. They'll want to depose you and your grandfather. They'll want the originals of everything, especially the planner and the letters. This is it, Dorian. This is where the narrative becomes official record. The deposition was set. The venue was different this time, a sterile conference room. In the DA's office, the stakes were higher. This wasn't about winning a house. It was about justice. My father arrived with Vaughn, but the slick confidence was gone. He was pale, his new suit seeming to hang off him. He looked like a man who hadn't slept, which he probably hadn't, when the assistant AE, a serious woman named Cruz, began her questions. She went straight for the throat. Mr. Marston, she began, addressing my father. Can you explain? The email filters set up on your father's account that redirected correspondence pertaining to the Christmas Creek property. Vaughn objected. Ms. Keller shut him down. The evidence was entered. Then came the planner. Then the piece de resistance. My mother's letters. Ms. Keller didn't introduce them all, just one. A first one I'd read in the attic. Cruz read it aloud in the quiet room. Dear Susan, I know we've never seen eye to eye, and maybe we never will, but Dorian is here now. And whatever you think of me, I hope one day you'll think of him differently. My father's face was ashen. He had no play for this. There was no legal maneuver for a dead woman's plea for her son. This wasn't about law anymore. It was about morality, and he was profoundly, utterly bankrupt. He refused to answer most questions, invoking his Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination. Each invocation was a silent admission of guilt that echoed louder than any confession. A week later, his lawyer called. Vaughn's voice was stripped of all its oily charm. It was just tired. He'll sign over the deed. The full, clean title. To Dorian, no strings. He won't fight the will. He just wants it to be over. There was no financial settlement mentioned. No DA. It was unconditional surrender. The DA's office had made it clear. A full cooperative transfer of assets would be looked upon favorably. He was trading the house for a chance at a lighter sentence. I stood in the hallway, phone to my ear, listening to the terms of my father's surrender. I felt no thrill, no euphoria, just a deep, settling calm. "Tell him I accept," I said, and hung up. The paperwork arrived by courier the next day. I signed where Miss Keller pointed. Grandpa signed as a witness. His signature was firm, final. When it was done, he looked at me. "It's over." "No," I said, looking down at the deed that now bore only my name. "It's just beginning." I didn't go back to the house immediately. I gave myself a month. I needed to let the legal dust settle, to let the emotional storm inside me calm. I spent the time with Grandpa, fixing the loose porch railing, talking about everything except the trial. We found a new rhythm, one built on silence that didn't need to be filled with lies. Finally, on a clear, cold morning, when spring was still just a promise, I drove to Christmas Creek. I didn't tell anyone I was going. I parked in the driveway. The place looked different, smaller, just a house. The grass was overgrown, and a single vine snaked across the porch step. The world had kept turning without their curated care. I used my new key, a brass key I'd had made, and unlocked the door. The click was different. It was mine. The air inside was still and silent. It smelled of lemon polish and emptiness. I walked slowly through the rooms. The dining table, the scene of the crime, stood empty. The curated photos were still on the walls, but they seemed silly now, like props after a play has ended. I went upstairs to the room that had been meant for me. It was still decorated in benign, impersonal beiges. I had brought a single box from the car. Inside was a photo of my mother and me, my college pennant, and the blue tin of letters. I placed the photo on the knitstand. I put the tin on the shelf. In the closet, I was not moving in. I was taking inventory. I spent the afternoon taking down every last trace of them. The porcelain angels, the motivational quotes about family, the staged photos of their perfect life. I boxed it all without anger, without malice. I was an archaeologist, carefully brushing the dust off a truth that had been buried for too long. I was finished. The house was empty. Just clean lines, empty rooms, and potential. I sat on the front porch steps as the sun began to set, the sky painting itself in shades of orange and purple. I held the brass key in my hand, feeling its weight. This key wasn't just to a door. It was to a future that had been locked away. And now I had the choice to open it or to throw the key away. The next morning, I drove to the county clerk's office. I didn't file a lawsuit or a motion. I filed a for sale sign. The market was strong. The offers would come quickly. The realtor, a cheerful woman named Brenda, gushed about the property's potential. I just nodded. She didn't see a house of lies. She saw a commission. And that was perfect. 2 weeks later, I accepted a full-price cash offer. The closing was swift, painless. As I signed the final papers, I felt no sense of loss, only a profound sense of gain. I had not sold a house. I had sold a ghost. On the last day before the new owners took possession, I returned one final time. The empty rooms echoed with the memories of that last Christmas dinner, but the echoes were faint, losing their power. They were just sounds in an empty space. I walked to the mantelpiece above the fireplace. It was bare. From my pocket, I took the one thing I had left to place. It was the photograph of my mother and me by Lake Michigan, the one where we were. both laughing, real and unposed. I didn't put it in a frame. I just leaned it against the wall, a final testament, a final reclaiming. Then I turned and walked out. I didn't look back. I closed the door behind me, the solid final thud of a fly. Story ending. I drove back to Chicago. Grandpa met me at the door with 2 mugs of coffee and a small, knowing smile. He didn't ask about the house. He just handed me an envelope, yellowed with age. "Found this tucked in one of your mother's old recipe books," he said. I opened it carefully. Her handwriting, familiar now, looped across the page. "If they ever forget who you are, remind them with grace. If they ever rewrite your place, write something louder. And when you come home, make sure it's yours." Mom, I folded the letter and put it in my wallet. Not as a weapon, but as a compass. That night, I slept without dreaming. In the morning, I made coffee for myself in my grandfather's kitchen in the house that had always been my home. The sun streamed through the window, catching dust motes dancing in the light. They looked like tiny stars that the war was over. The revenge was complete. It wasn't the violent, fiery explosion I might have once imagined. It was quieter, more profound. It was the simple, unwavering act of speaking a truth that others had tried to silence. It was reclaiming my name. It was choosing my own home. And as I sat there, listening to Grandpa humming in the next room, I realized the sweetest revenge wasn't in taking everything from them. It was in finally having everything I needed without them.